The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Harvard University's Kennedy School as Karoline Leavitt adjusted her blazer and checked her phone one last time. She had arrived early for the Policy Innovation Forum, a gathering that brought together some of the brightest minds in politics, economics, and public policy. At 25, Karoline had already made a name for herself as a sharp political communications strategist who could handle any debate that came her way. Walking through the marble corridors, she felt confident and prepared. This wasn't her first time at Harvard, and it certainly wouldn't be her last. She had spent years building her reputation on being quick-thinking, well-informed, and never backing down from an intellectual challenge. Her colleagues often joked that she could argue her way out of anything, and honestly, she took pride in that reputation. The main conference hall was buzzing with activity. Distinguished professors in their tweed jackets mingled with young graduate students clutching their coffee cups like lifelines. Policy experts from Washington, D.C. chatted with academics who rarely left their ivory towers. It was exactly the kind of environment where Karoline thrived. Smart people discussing important issues with plenty of opportunities to showcase her knowledge and make valuable connections. She grabbed a coffee from the refreshment station and started making her rounds, exchanging business cards and engaging in the kind of polite but competitive conversation that defined these academic gatherings. Everyone here was trying to impress everyone else, and Karoline was no exception. She had talking points ready for every major policy issue of the day, from healthcare reform to climate change to artificial intelligence regulation. The first session went well. Karoline participated actively in the panel discussion about social media's impact on political discourse, making several points that earned nods of approval from the audience. During the Q&A, she fielded questions with ease, demonstrating the kind of quick thinking that had served her well throughout her career. As people filed out for the morning break, several attendees approached her with compliments and follow-up questions. Feeling good about her performance, Karoline headed back to the refreshment area. The coffee was decent, and the pastries looked tempting. She was reaching for a croissant when she noticed something unusual happening near the corner of the room. A small crowd had gathered around one of the high-top tables, and there seemed to be some kind of intense discussion taking place. Curious, she moved closer to see what was drawing everyone's attention. What she saw surprised her. At the center of the group stood a young girl who couldn't have been more than 16 years old. She had long black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wore a casual button-down shirt with dark jeans. Definitely not the typical attire for this kind of formal academic gathering. But what was really striking wasn't her appearance, it was the way she was speaking. The girl was engaged in what appeared to be a complex discussion about economic policy with several graduate students and at least 2 professors that Karoline recognized from earlier sessions. And she wasn't just participating in the conversation, she was leading it. The fundamental issue with current AI regulation proposals, the teenager was saying in a calm, clear voice, is that they're trying to apply traditional regulatory frameworks to a technology that operates on completely different principles. It's like trying to regulate the internet using laws written for telegraph systems. One of the graduate students, a tall guy with thick glasses who looked to be in his late 20s, jumped in. But you have to start somewhere, right? Even imperfect. Regulation is better than no regulation at all. The girl tilted her head slightly, considering this. That's a reasonable assumption, but let me show you why it might not be true in this case. She pulled out a small tablet and began sketching what looked like mathematical equations. If we model the potential outcomes using game theory, we can see that poorly designed regulations actually create worse outcomes than no regulations in systems with high adaptability rates. Karoline found herself stepping closer, drawn in despite herself. The girl's explanation was fascinating but also somewhat irritating. There was something about her calm confidence that rubbed Karoline the wrong way. Maybe it was the way she spoke with such certainty, or maybe it was how the graduate students were hanging on her every word like she was some kind of oracle. The math is pretty straightforward, the girl continued, now drawing diagrams that looked more complex than anything Karoline had seen since her college statistics course. When you introduce regulatory constraints into a rapidly evolving system, you create artificial bottlenecks that force innovation into potentially dangerous, directions. It's actually counterproductive to the stated goals of the regulation. A professor with gray hair and a Harvard faculty pin leaned forward. That's an interesting theoretical perspective, but in the real world, we have to consider political feasibility. Perfect solutions that can't be implemented aren't really solutions at all. I understand that perspective, the girl replied without missing a beat, but I think we're creating a false choice between perfect theoretical solutions and politically feasible but ineffective practical ones. There's actually a third option that most policy discussions miss entirely. Now Karoline was really intrigued, and also somewhat annoyed. Who was this kid? And why was everyone treating her like she had all the answers? She had been working in policy and communications for years, dealing with real-world political challenges every day. The idea that some teenager could waltz into a Harvard forum and start lecturing graduate students and professors about how the world really worked was just too much. She decided to move closer and listen more carefully. Maybe the girl would say something naive or oversimplified that Karoline could politely correct. After all, there's a big difference between theoretical knowledge and practical experience, and Karoline had plenty of the latter. The key insight, the girl was explaining, comes from complexity science. Instead of trying to control these systems directly, we can design incentive structures that guide their evolution in beneficial directions. Think of it like creating a landscape where the natural flow of innovation leads toward outcomes we want, rather than building walls to prevent outcomes we don't want. The graduate students were nodding enthusiastically, and even the professors looked impressed. Karoline had to admit that it sounded sophisticated, but she wasn't convinced. In her experience, policymaking was about compromise, negotiation, and the art of the possible. It was messy and human and political. You couldn't just apply mathematical models to complex social problems and expect them to work in the real world. That sounds lovely in theory, someone said, and Karoline realized, with surprise, that the voice was her own. The group turned to look at her, and she felt a momentary flutter of nervousness. But she pressed on, drawing on her years of experience in political communications. I mean, it's a fascinating academic exercise, she continued, stepping into the circle. But in the real world of politics and policymaking, things work quite differently. You're dealing with competing interests, limited resources, and political constraints that can't just be optimized away with mathematical models. The girl looked at her with genuine curiosity rather than defensiveness. That's a really important point, she said. I'd love to hear more about how those practical constraints affect policy outcomes. Could you give me some specific examples of how political realities have shaped AI regulation efforts? Karoline felt a moment of surprise. She had expected pushback, or argument, not genuine interest. But she quickly recovered and launched into what she thought would be an educational explanation for this obviously bright but inexperienced young person. Well, take the recent discussions about AI safety standards, she began. In theory, you might want to implement comprehensive testing requirements for all AI systems before deployment. But in practice, you have to consider the lobbying power of tech companies, the concerns of small startups who can't afford extensive testing, the international competitiveness issues if other countries don't have the same requirements, and the simple fact that most legislators don't understand the technology well enough to write detailed technical standards. The girl nodded thoughtfully, making notes on her tablet. Those are all really important factors. How do current policy proposals attempt to balance these competing pressures? Encouraged by what seemed like respectful attention, Karoline continued. That's where the art of compromise comes in. You end up with legislation that's probably less than ideal from a pure safety perspective, but that can actually get passed and implemented. It's about finding the sweet spot between what experts think should happen and what's politically achievable. That makes a lot of sense, the girl replied. But I'm curious about something. When you say what's politically achievable, how is that determined? Is it based on polling data or lobbying pressure or something else? Karoline was starting to feel more comfortable. This was exactly the kind of conversation she excelled at, explaining the practical realities of policy making to someone who clearly had book smarts but lacked real-world experience. It's a combination, of factors, she explained. You have to consider public opinion, but also the positions of key stakeholders, the political priorities of elected officials, budget constraints, and the broader political climate. A policy that might be popular with the general public could still be impossible to pass if it faces strong opposition from powerful interest groups. The girl was still taking notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions that showed she was paying close attention. The other people in the group had gone quiet, apparently content to listen to what was developing into an interesting discussion between theoretical and practical perspectives. I think I understand the framework you're describing, the girl said after a few minutes. But I'm wondering if there might be some assumptions built into that approach that could be examined more closely. Would you mind if I shared some analysis I've been working on that might relate to what you're talking about? Sure, Karoline said with a smile that she hoped looked encouraging rather than patronizing. I'd be interested to hear your perspective. What happened next would change everything Karoline thought she knew about intelligence, humility, and the dangerous assumptions we make about age and wisdom. But in that moment, standing in the Harvard conference room with a coffee cup in one hand and complete confidence in the other, she had no idea that she was about to encounter a mind that would challenge everything she thought she understood about how the world really works. Maya pulled up a new screen on her tablet and turned it, so everyone in the small group could see. What appeared on the screen looked like a complex web of interconnected circles and lines, with numbers and symbols that made Karoline's head spin, just looking at it. This is a network analysis of the policy-making process you just described, Maya said in that same calm voice that was starting to make Karoline feel slightly uncomfortable. I mapped out the relationships between different stakeholders, their influence levels, and the feedback loops that determine policy outcomes. Karoline glanced at the diagram and tried to make sense of it. It looked impressive, sure, but she wasn't convinced it meant anything practical. That's very sophisticated, she said, maintaining her encouraging tone. But I'm not sure how mathematical models can capture the human elements of political decision-making. Politics is about relationships, emotions, and often completely irrational choices. You're absolutely right about the human elements being crucial, Maya replied. That's actually what makes this analysis so interesting. Let me show you what happens when we account for those factors. She tapped the screen a few times and the diagram changed. New connections appeared. Some lines got thicker while others got thinner, and colors shifted across the network. It was like watching a living system breathe and change. The irrational choices you mentioned aren't actually random, Maya continued. They follow predictable patterns based on cognitive biases, social pressures, and structural incentives. When we map these patterns mathematically, we can see why certain policies succeed while others fail, even when the failing policies seem more logical on paper. One of the graduate students leaned in closer. Can you give us a specific example? Maya nodded and pulled up what looked like a case study. Let's look at the AI safety legislation that was proposed last year but never made it out of committee. The conventional analysis would say it failed because of industry lobbying and political opposition. But if we look at the mathematical model, she traced her finger along different parts of the diagram, explaining how information flowed through the network of decision-makers. As she spoke, Karoline found herself following along despite her initial skepticism. The girl was describing real political events that Karoline remembered well, but from a completely different angle. The key insight is here, Maya said, pointing to a cluster of interconnected nodes. The policy failed not because of direct opposition, but because it created what we call an information cascade failure. The technical complexity of the proposals meant that most legislators relied on simplified explanations from advisors, but those advisors were getting their information from sources with competing agendas. Karoline felt a flicker of recognition. She remembered the confusion and conflicting reports that had surrounded that particular piece of legislation. At the time, she had attributed it to normal political chaos, but Maya was describing a systematic pattern. So you're saying the policy failed because of communication problems? Asked one of the professors. Not exactly, Maya replied. It failed because the structure of the information network made accurate communication almost impossible. Even if everyone involved had been acting in good faith, the system was designed to produce confusion and deadlock. Now Karoline was really paying attention. This wasn't just theoretical speculation anymore. Maya was describing political dynamics that Karoline had witnessed firsthand, but explaining them in a way that revealed underlying patterns she had never noticed. "But that's just one case study," Karoline said, though her voice carried less certainty than it had a few minutes earlier. "Political outcomes are influenced by so many variables that I'm not sure you can make general predictions based on mathematical models." Maya looked at her with what seemed like genuine respect. "That's a really good point, and it gets to the heart of complexity science. You're right that individual political outcomes are hard to predict because there are too many variables. But that's exactly why network analysis is useful. Instead of trying to predict specific outcomes, we can identify structural problems that make good outcomes less likely across many different situations." She pulled up another screen that showed multiple case studies arranged in a grid. "I've analyzed about 50 different policy initiatives from the past 5 years, across different issue areas and political contexts. What's fascinating is that the successful policies share certain network characteristics, while the failed policies show similar structural problems." Karoline studied the screen, trying to make sense of the patterns Maya was pointing out. Despite herself, she was becoming genuinely curious. "What kind of structural problems?" "The most common one is what I call expertise isolation," Maya explained. "The people who understand the technical details of a policy are separated from the people who have political influence by too many intermediary steps. By the time information travels from experts to decision makers, it gets so distorted that good policies look bad and bad policies look good." The graduate student with glasses jumped in. "So you're saying the system is broken?" "Not broken exactly, but sub-optimized," Maya replied. "It's like having a really powerful computer running inefficient software. The hardware is capable of much better performance, but the program structure creates bottlenecks and errors." Karoline felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time during a policy discussion. She was learning something genuinely new, not just new facts or perspectives, but a completely different way of thinking about problems she thought she already understood. "Let me ask you something," she said, and realized her tone had shifted from teaching to genuinely inquiring. "If you can identify these structural problems, do you have ideas about how to fix them?" Maya's face lit up with enthusiasm. "That's the exciting part. Once you understand the network dynamics, you can design interventions that leverage the system's natural tendencies instead of fighting against them." She pulled up a new diagram that showed the same network structure, but with several new connections highlighted in bright green. "These are what I call bridge connections, strategic relationships that can dramatically improve information flow without requiring major institutional changes." As Maya explained her proposed solutions, Karoline found herself both impressed and slightly overwhelmed. The girl wasn't just identifying problems, she was proposing specific, actionable solutions that seemed both innovative and surprisingly practical. "For example," Maya continued, "instead of trying to educate all legislators about technical details, you create structured communication channels between subject matter experts and key staff members who specialize in translating complex information into policy language. It's like having professional interpreters for technical knowledge." "That's actually brilliant," said one of the professors, and Karoline found herself nodding in agreement. But as the conversation continued, Karoline began to feel something else, creeping in alongside her growing respect, an uncomfortable realization about the limitations of her own perspective. She had spent years developing expertise in political communications, and she was good at it. But Maya was revealing entire dimensions of the policy-making process that Karoline had never even considered. "I have to ask," Karoline said, her curiosity now completely overriding her initial defensiveness. "How did you develop this framework? This isn't the kind of analysis they teach in typical political science courses." Maya smiled for the first time since the conversation had started. "You're right, it's not traditional political science. I started with mathematical modeling of complex systems, then applied those tools to social and political networks. Most of my background is actually in theoretical mathematics and computer science." "How old are you?" asked the graduate student, voicing the question everyone was thinking. 16, Maya replied matter-of-factly. I know that's young for this kind of work, but age doesn't really matter for mathematical analysis. Numbers work. The same way whether you're 16 or 60. The group fell silent for a moment. Karoline felt a mixture of amazement and something that might have been embarrassment. Here she had been, ready to educate this young person about how the real world works, and instead she was getting schooled in ways of understanding that world that were far more sophisticated than anything she had encountered in her professional career. I hope I'm not coming across as arrogant, Maya added, seeming to sense the shift in the group's mood. I know I have a lot to learn about the practical side of politics. That's actually why I wanted to hear your perspective, Karoline. The mathematical models can identify structural problems, but implementing solutions requires the kind of practical knowledge and political wisdom that only comes from real experience. Karoline felt a complex mix of emotions. Part of her was genuinely impressed by Maya's intellect and the insights she was sharing. But another part of her was struggling with the realization that her years of experience, while valuable, represented just one piece of a much larger and more complex puzzle. Your analysis is remarkable, Karoline said, and meant it. But I'm curious about something. You've identified these structural problems and proposed solutions, but how do you account for the human resistance to change? Even if your solutions are mathematically optimal, getting people to adopt them is a whole different challenge. Maya paused, considering the question carefully. That's probably the most important question you could ask, she said. And honestly, it's where I need the most help. I can model the systems, but I don't have enough experience with the human dynamics to know how to make change actually happen. For the first time since the conversation had started, Karoline felt like she was back on familiar ground. Now that, she said with a genuine smile, is something I do know quite a bit about. What neither of them realized was that their exchange had attracted a much larger audience than just the original small group. Other conference attendees had quietly gathered around, drawn by the unusual sight of a seasoned political professional and a teenage genius engaged in serious intellectual discourse. Some were taking notes, others were discreetly recording on their phones, and everyone was wondering what would happen next in this unexpected encounter between two very different kinds of intelligence. As Karoline and Maya continued their discussion, neither of them noticed that their small group had grown considerably. What started as a casual conversation between a few people had slowly attracted more and more conference attendees. Professors had paused their own conversations to listen in. Graduate students had abandoned their networking efforts to crowd around the table. Even some of the conference organizers had stopped to see what was drawing such attention. Dr. Richardson, one of the senior faculty members from Harvard's government department, stood at the edge of the growing crowd with a puzzled expression. In 30 years of organizing academic conferences, he had never seen anything quite like this. Usually, the most exciting thing that happened during coffee breaks was someone spilling their drink on their notes. This is fascinating, Karoline was saying, now completely absorbed in Maya's explanation of network theory. But let me give you a concrete example of how political reality complicates your mathematical models. She pulled out her own phone and showed Maya a series of text messages from the previous month. These are from when I was working on messaging strategy for a healthcare policy proposal. Look at how the conversation changed over just 3 days. Maya studied the messages carefully, her analytical mind clearly processing the information. I see what you mean. The stakeholder positions shifted based on factors that weren't directly related to the policy content itself. Exactly, Karoline said, feeling energized by their exchange. On Monday, everyone was supportive. By Wednesday, half the coalition had pulled out because one senator made an offhand comment on a talk show that got blown out of proportion on social media. That's actually a perfect example of what I call cascade amplification, Maya replied, excitedly. Small perturbations in the information network can create massive shifts in the overall system state. It's mathematically similar to how avalanches work in physics. The crowd around them had grown to at least 20 people, but Karoline and Maya were so focused on their conversation that they remained oblivious to their audience. Their discussion had evolved from a confrontation to a collaboration, with each woman contributing insights that built on what the other was saying. So if you can predict these cascade effects, Karoline asked, could you also potentially prevent them? In theory, yes, Maya said, her eyes lighting up with possibility. If you understand the network structure well enough, you can identify the critical nodes where small interventions might prevent large-scale disruptions. Dr. Richardson exchanged glances with his colleague, Dr. Park, from the economics department. They had both been following the conversation and were increasingly amazed by what they were witnessing. This wasn't just an interesting academic discussion. It was a genuine breakthrough in thinking about policy implementation. May I interrupt for just a moment? Dr. Richardson said, stepping forward. Both women looked up, suddenly aware that they had attracted quite an audience. Karoline felt a moment of embarrassment. She hadn't realized how animated she had become during their discussion, or how much of a scene they were creating. Maya, for her part, looked mildly surprised but not particularly concerned about the attention. I apologize for interrupting, Dr. Richardson continued, but I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. What you're discussing has profound implications for how we think about policy design and implementation. Would you be willing to continue this discussion in a more formal setting, perhaps as an impromptu panel for the rest of the conference attendees? Karoline and Maya looked at each other, and something passed between them. A mutual understanding that what they had stumbled into was worth sharing with others. I'd be interested in that, Maya said simply. Absolutely, Karoline agreed, though she felt a flutter of nervousness. Formal presentations were one thing, but this kind of spontaneous collaborative discussion was new territory for her. Within 20 minutes, the conference organizers had rearranged the schedule. The afternoon session that had been planned was postponed and chairs were quickly set up in the main conference room. Word had spread throughout the building that something unusual was happening, and attendees who had stepped out for lunch were hurrying back. As people filed into the room, Karoline noticed several participants pulling out their phones to record. In the age of social media, interesting academic discussions often found their way onto Twitter and LinkedIn, sometimes reaching audiences far beyond the original conference. I have to admit I'm a little nervous, Karoline whispered to Maya as they waited for everyone to settle in. Really? You seem so comfortable speaking in public, Maya replied with genuine surprise. Prepared presentations, yes, but this kind of open-ended discussion is different. What if we don't have anything interesting to say? Maya smiled. I think we've already proven that's not going to be a problem. Dr. Richardson stood up to introduce them. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a unique opportunity this afternoon. What started as an informal conversation during our coffee break has evolved into what I believe is a genuinely important dialogue about the intersection of theoretical analysis and practical policy implementation. He gestured toward Karoline and Maya, who were sitting at a small table at the front of the room. Karoline Leavitt is a political communications strategist with extensive experience in policy advocacy and implementation. Maya Chen is a 16-year-old mathematical prodigy who has been applying complexity science to social and political systems. Their conversation this morning revealed insights that I think will be valuable to all of us. The room was packed. Every seat was filled and people were standing along the walls. Karoline had never had an audience this engaged before a word was even spoken. Why don't you start by sharing some of the key insights from your earlier discussion? Dr. Richardson suggested. Karoline looked at Maya, who nodded encouragingly. Well, Karoline began, I think the most important thing we discovered is that we were both right and both wrong about how policymaking works. A ripple of interested murmurs went through the audience. I came into our conversation thinking that Maya's mathematical approach was too theoretical to be useful in real-world politics, Karoline continued, and Maya was working with models that didn't fully account for the human and political factors that often determine policy outcomes. But when we started combining our perspectives, Maya picked up the thread. We realized that mathematical modeling can actually help explain why certain political strategies succeed or fail, and practical political experience can help identify which variables are most important to include in the models. For the next hour, they walked through several case studies together, with Karoline providing the political context and Maya explaining the underlying mathematical patterns. The audience was captivated. Questions came from all directions, and the discussion ranged from healthcare policy to climate change to economic regulation. What made the session particularly compelling was how Karoline and Maya built on each other's insights. When Karoline described a political challenge, Maya would show how mathematical analysis could provide new solutions. When Maya presented a theoretical framework, Karoline would explain how to navigate the practical obstacles to implementation. "This is remarkable," commented Dr. Park during the Q&A period. "You're essentially creating a new framework for understanding policy effectiveness that bridges the gap between academic theory and political practice." About halfway through the session, Karoline noticed that several people in the audience were actively posting on social media. She could see phones held up recording their discussion and tablets where people were taking detailed notes. What had started as an impromptu conversation was clearly resonating with people far beyond the conference room. During a brief break, Maya leaned over to Karoline. "I keep thinking about what you said earlier about resistance to change. Even if we can design better policies mathematically, how do we get people to actually adopt them?" "That's the million-dollar question," Karoline replied. "And honestly, working with you today has given me some new ideas about that too." "Really? How so?" "Well, look at what happened to us this morning. I came in thinking I knew how policy worked, and you came in with mathematical models. We were both a little defensive about our approaches at first. But once we started actually listening to each other and building on each other's ideas, we came up with insights that neither of us could have reached alone." Maya nodded thoughtfully. "So you're saying the key to implementing better policies might be creating more opportunities for this kind of collaborative thinking?" "Exactly. Instead of having experts talking to other experts and politicians talking to other politicians, we need more spaces where different types of expertise can come together and cross-pollinate." When the formal session resumed, they shared this insight with the audience. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Several attendees started talking about ways to create similar collaborative opportunities in their own institutions and organizations. As the afternoon session wound down, Dr. Richardson stood up again. "I think I speak for everyone here when I say that this has been one of the most thought-provoking discussions we've had at any conference in recent memory. The collaboration between theoretical analysis and practical experience that we've witnessed today points toward new possibilities for how we approach complex policy challenges." The audience applauded enthusiastically, and several people approached Karoline and Maya afterward to continue the conversation. Business cards were exchanged, contact information was shared, and plans were made for follow-up discussions. But what neither Karoline nor Maya realized as they packed up their notes and prepared to leave was that their conversation had already begun to have an impact far beyond the conference room. Social media posts about their discussion were being shared and commented on by people who hadn't even been at the conference. Videos of their session were being uploaded to academic networks and professional forums. Within hours, policy innovation and Tao theory meets practice were trending topics in academic and policy circles on Twitter. Their impromptu collaboration had struck a chord with people who were hungry for new approaches to persistent policy challenges. The real shock, however, was still to come. What had started as a chance encounter between two very different thinkers was about to become something much larger and more significant than either of them had imagined. By the time Karoline got back to her hotel room that evening, her phone was buzzing nonstop with notifications. Text messages, emails, LinkedIn requests, and Twitter mentions were flooding in faster than she could read them. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone screen in disbelief. The hashtag Dying Policy Innovation was trending nationwide, and videos of her discussion with Maya had been viewed thousands of times. News outlets were reaching out for interviews. Think tanks were sending collaboration requests. Academic institutions were asking if she and Maya would consider speaking at their events. "This is insane," she muttered to herself, scrolling through message after message from people she had never met, all wanting to know more about the framework she and Maya had developed. Meanwhile, across town in her family's temporary apartment near Harvard, Maya was experiencing something similar. Her phone had been ringing all evening with calls from reporters, researchers, and policy organizations. Her parents were both amazed and slightly overwhelmed by the sudden attention their daughter was receiving. "Maya, there's someone from the Washington Post on the phone," her mother called from the kitchen. "They want to interview you about your work." Maya looked up from her laptop where she had been reading through the social media posts about their conference session. "Can you tell them I'll call back tomorrow? I'm trying to understand what's happening here." What was happening was something neither Maya nor Karoline had expected. Their collaboration had touched a nerve in the policy world. For years, academics had been frustrated by the gap between research and real-world implementation. Politicians and policy practitioners had been equally frustrated by research that seemed out of touch with practical realities. Their conversation had shown a way to bridge that gap, and people were excited about the possibilities. The next morning, Karoline woke up to find that their story had made it onto several major news websites. The headlines were variations on the same theme: "Young Genius and Political Pro-Show New Way Forward for Policymaking," and "16-year-old mathematician teams up with communications expert to revolutionize politics." But it was one particular article that really caught her attention. A respected political journalist had written a piece titled, "The Humility to Learn: What Washington Can Teach Us About Intelligence." The article focused not on Maya's mathematical abilities or Karoline's political experience, but on how their willingness to listen to each other had led to breakthrough insights. Karoline found herself reading that article 3 times. The journalist had interviewed several conference attendees who described how unusual it was to see two people from such different backgrounds genuinely learning from each other instead of trying to prove who was smarter. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed Maya's name. "Are you seeing all this?" Maya asked without preamble. "It's unbelievable," Karoline replied. "I've never had anything like this kind of response to my work before." "Me neither. And honestly, I'm not sure what to do with it. I've gotten interview requests from news programs I've never even heard of." Karoline sat up straighter. "Maya, I've been thinking about something. What if this attention isn't really about us? What if it's about what we represent?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe people are responding so strongly because they're hungry for examples of collaboration across different types of expertise. Everyone's so used to experts talking past each other or trying to prove they're right. Maybe seeing two people actually learn from each other is refreshing." Maya was quiet for a moment. "That makes sense. And if that's true, then maybe we have a responsibility to do something constructive with this attention." "What did you have in mind?" "Well, yesterday you mentioned creating more spaces where different types of expertise can come together. What if we actually did that? What if we used this momentum to start something that could help other people have the kind of productive collaboration we stumbled into?" Karoline felt a spark of excitement. "You mean like an organization or program?" "Maybe. I'm not sure exactly what form it would take. But I keep thinking about all the problems that could be solved if more people were willing to combine theoretical analysis with practical experience the way we did." Over the next several hours, they talked through possibilities. Maya's mathematical mind naturally started sketching out frameworks and systems, while Karoline's political experience helped identify potential obstacles and opportunities. By the end of their conversation, they had outlined a plan for something they decided to call the Bridge Institute. The idea was simple: create a platform that would bring together young theoretical thinkers with experienced practitioners across various fields, not just politics and policy, but business, education, healthcare, environmental issues, and technology. The goal would be to foster the kind of collaborative problem-solving they had experienced at Harvard. "But here's what I think is really important," Karoline said as they refined their concept. "It can't just be about young people learning from older people, or vice versa. It has to be genuinely mutual. Everyone involved has to be willing to have their assumptions challenged." "Absolutely," Maya agreed. "The mathematical models are only useful if they're informed by real-world experience. And practical experience is only effective if it's open to new frameworks for understanding problems." Within a week, they had received enough interest and potential funding offers to make the Bridge Institute a reality. A technology entrepreneur who had seen their Harvard discussion offered to provide initial funding. Several universities expressed interest in hosting programs. Policy organizations wanted to participate. Even some government agencies reached out to explore partnerships. But perhaps the most significant response came from an unexpected source. Dr. Richardson, the Harvard professor who had organized their impromptu session, called Karoline with a proposal. "I've been thinking about your discussion all week," he said, "and I believe you two have identified something that could fundamentally change how we approach policy education. Would you be interested in developing a curriculum that other institutions could adopt?" "What kind of curriculum?" Karoline asked. "Something that teaches policy analysis by combining mathematical modeling with practical political experience. Instead of teaching theory and practice as separate subjects, students would learn to integrate both approaches from the beginning." The idea excited both Karoline and Maya. Traditional policy education often left students well-versed in either academic theory or practical politics, but rarely both. A curriculum that integrated these approaches could produce a new generation of policy professionals who were comfortable working across different types of expertise. As they developed their plans, something interesting happened to both women, personally. Karoline found herself increasingly interested in the theoretical frameworks that Maya used to analyze political systems. She started reading academic papers on complexity science and network theory, discovering insights that enhanced her practical work. Maya, meanwhile, became fascinated by the human dynamics of policy implementation that Karoline had introduced her to. She began studying negotiation theory, organizational psychology, and the history of successful policy changes, finding that these subjects informed her mathematical models in important ways. "I think I'm becoming a better political strategist because of what you've taught me about systems thinking," Karoline told Maya during one of their regular planning calls. "And I'm becoming a better mathematician because of what you've taught me about human motivation and political constraints," Maya replied. "It's like we're both expanding the tools we have available to solve problems." 6 months after their initial meeting at Harvard, Karoline and Maya stood together on stage at the inaugural Bridge Institute conference. The audience included policymakers, researchers, students, and practitioners from dozens of different fields. The energy in the room was electric with possibility. "When we first met," Karoline told the audience, "I thought I was going to teach a brilliant young person about how the real world works. Instead, she taught me that my understanding of the real world was incomplete." Maya picked up the thought. "And I thought mathematical analysis could solve policy problems on its own. Instead, I learned that the most important insights come from combining different types of knowledge and different perspectives." "The real shock," Karoline continued, "wasn't that a 16-year-old could outthink me in certain areas. The shock was discovering how much more we could both accomplish when we stopped trying to prove who was smarter and started trying to learn from each other." The audience erupted in applause, but what moved Karoline most was seeing the faces in the crowd. There were teenagers sitting next to retired executives, professors next to small business owners, policy wonks next to community activists. The Bridge Institute had attracted exactly the kind of diverse collaboration they had hoped for. In the months that followed, Bridge Institute programs were launched at 12 universities. Policy organizations began adopting their collaborative framework. Several pieces of legislation were developed using their integrated approach, with notably better outcomes than traditional policy development processes. But perhaps the most meaningful result was less tangible. Stories began emerging of other, unexpected collaborations sparked by their example. An urban planner and a high school student redesigned traffic patterns in their city. A retired diplomat and a college sophomore developed a new approach to international development. A small-town mayor and a computer science graduate student created an innovative solution to local healthcare access. "You know what I think our real contribution has been?" Maya asked Karoline one evening as they reviewed applications for the next Bridge Institute cohort. "What's that?" "We showed people that intellectual humility isn't a weakness. It's actually the foundation of real intelligence. Being smart enough to know what you don't know, and curious enough to learn from people who know different things." Karoline smiled. "And maybe we proved that the most interesting conversations happen when people are brave enough to admit they might be wrong." Looking back, Neither of them could have predicted that a chance encounter over coffee would lead to such profound changes in their own lives, and in the broader conversation about how smart people can work together to solve complex problems. The real shock hadn't been Maya's intelligence or Karoline's political savvy. The shock had been discovering what becomes possible when different kinds of wisdom come together with mutual respect and genuine curiosity.